we are running a little behind, and so we are gonna push right through into our next panel, but if there's more food outside, people need to take care of their biological needs, by all means do so. There's sign-in sheets that Erica, and I ask you to put some of these around the room. If you are here for CLE, make sure you find one of those and sign on to it at some point with your bar information. I think we've got our virtual panelists online. Representative Macri is finishing her lunch and will shoot her way on up to the podium. And I will queue up our next PowerPoint and we'll get rolling.
Anybody need CLE? Yeah.
Right. I will give you one more minute to take care of yourselves and we'll get rolling. While we're doing that, we go around Judith, members of the mic check. Judith, can you try and take yourself off mute?
Yes, higher.
All right, that works. Rep Anwar.
I'm right here. Thank you.
All right. And Kath.
Hey.
All right, good.
No,
All right, one more.
yeah, there's like a first. Yeah. Oh, no. Well, yes. Is that many of our yes, our writings are for the few hours. Like I'm doing. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Oh, I am starting back again. So now we know why it's so important for us to make housing a universally enjoyed human right. And I'm excited to move us on to our first plenary panel, where we'll hear about some of the amazing work being done across the country to put that in place. I said boop. All right. So on this plenary panel, I will start us off with an overview of what the human right to housing actually looks like, and the state of the advocacy all across the country. And then we'll hear from Connecticut Senator Saud Anwar, who's introduced legislation in Connecticut to make housing a state recognized human right multiple years running, and has gotten it very close to passing, though we'll hear more about some of the challenges he's faced as well. Then we'll have one of tonight's honorees, Washington Representative Nicole Macri, who will talk more about how she's taken a rights-based approach to tenant protections in Washington state, as well as addressing some of the systemic issues around zoning that would force communities to actually build the affordable housing and shelter that they need. In other words, a rights-based approach to making sure that those systemic issues are fixed. Kath Rogers from the ACLU of Southern California will tell us about a statewide coalition that they're building to amend this California state constitution to recognize housing as a human right. And Judith Samuels will bring it down to the local level in New York City, where the city has long had a right to shelter, but advocates have come to realize the limitations of that system and now want to push beyond to the full right to adequate housing. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end, so we'll look forward to having a conversation there. But first, I want to start with a little thought experiment. Imagine a person forced to live on a cold concrete slab, exposed to the elements, sleep deprived, denied adequate food and water, humiliated and degraded, threatened and harassed by law enforcement. Got that picture in your head? I've got a picture in my head too. And when it's these pictures, there's no doubt that it's a human rights violation, right? But now, thanks to our advocacy, when it's this one, it's now recognized as such, not only at the international level, through recommendations that we've gotten from a number of international human rights bodies, but also at the domestic level, where we have HUD acknowledging criminalizing homelessness violates our human rights obligations, and turning that recognition into important grant incentives that advocates have used in their communities to help stop the criminalization of homelessness. We also have the Department of Justice submitting a brief in our 8th Amendment, Martin versus Boise case, affirming our position that criminalizing basic life-sustaining conduct violates our Constitution, and later acknowledging that that was in fact an acknowledgement of our human rights obligations as well. And all of this ultimately helping to create a decision from the Ninth Circuit, which is now making a difference in the lives of people across the country. Homeless people are sleeping safer tonight because of human rights advocacy work at the international level, which then we brought back into our domestic advocacy. And so we have changed the baseline of the conversation on the issue of criminalization so that local advocates are able to use these standards to prevent people from being punished for not having a home to live in. But that's not actually saying that they need to be given that home to live in. So we need to now take it to the next step. And it's actually not new to talk about things like housing as a human right. As far back as 1967, people had realized that just getting the legal right to not be segregated in housing didn't mean anything if the underlying human right to adequate housing wasn't being guaranteed. And in fact, even earlier, people were realizing it was important to talk about not just civil rights, but human rights. Coming out of a post-war environment where countries realized that economic rights were just as important as political rights in preventing the rebirth of fascism. In the words of Franklin Roosevelt, hunger is a breeding ground for tyranny, a lesson we're reminded of today as millions of Americans, scared about how they're going to pay the rent or feed their families, are taken advantage of by politicians who offer them scapegoats to blame and promise them privileges in exchange for their liberties. But back in the 1940s, the right to adequate housing was enshrined along the rights to non-discrimination, to free speech, to fair trials, to education, and many other rights we take for granted in Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, or the Second Bill of Rights, as well as in international documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, because the US was engaged in the Cold War at the time, and many of the economic and social rights were championed by the Soviet Union, those soon took a backseat to other civil and political rights here in the US, and we've lost that sense of legal obligation to apply these rights domestically. But even though it's enshrined in some of these international documents, we can say that this concept of the right of every family to a decent home is not a foreign imposition on us. This is as American as apple pie. And all this has led up to the present, where we can finally bring things back full circle from the criminalization of homelessness back to the human right to housing, because in 2020, despite it being hashtag 2020, through our human rights advocacy, we got half of the Democratic presidential nominees to articulate housing as a human right, including Julian Castro, who put it as the headline of his campaign and his T-shirt. So I obviously had to get that. We also have had Congress members introduce bills actively identifying housing as a human right at the federal level and putting other substantive legislation up in order to actually put it into effect and naming it as a right. And it's why folks like Representative Cori Bush, who we'll be honoring also later tonight, slept out on the streets of the Capitol, holding our nation's conscience to account for the expiration of the eviction moratorium under a banner that said housing is a human right. And at the state level, as we'll hear more about later, after the Moms for Housing took over an Oakland home to self-enforce their human right to housing, we worked with them to turn that into a constitutional amendment introduced in California that would make a housing an enforceable human right for all in the state. And when President Biden came into office, he did so for the first time since FDR with the message that housing should be recognized as a basic human right to which all Americans are entitled. And we've emphasized in administration that it's important to keep naming that and framing that as a right. And they've come through with statements from Secretary Fudge and others. And the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness is making sure that those values are being put into practice in the drafting of their new federal strategic plan to end homelessness. And in fact, thanks to the coordinated advocacy of many in this room, making housing a human right was the #1 message that USICH heard from the field in its consultations in advance of drafting the plan. So hopefully I've established that housing is a human right, and it is an effective slogan that people are rallying behind. But what does that actually mean in practice, and why is it so important to talk about it this way? Because it isn't just a rallying slogan. At the international level, it's a rich source of legal norms that create a comprehensive guarantee of that right. It includes the right to substantive equality, remedying historical discrimination in the housing market. It's more than just 4 walls and a roof over your head. It's about the ability to live in dignity and safety. And most critically, it's not just aspirational language, but a practical tool that advocates can use to actually hold their governments accountable. Said boop. So at the international level, the human right to housing is built on these 4 building blocks of participation, equity, accountability, and interdependence. And these are applicable to all human rights, serve as the base of all human rights. Within the right to housing itself, there are 7 elements, including the security of tenure, the ability for people to have legal guarantees against forced evictions, harassment, and other threats, the availability of services, materials, and infrastructure. So people have to have access to safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, energy for cooking and heating and lighting, food and waste disposal, affordability. The cost of housing must not threaten or compromise the occupant's enjoyment of other human rights. So here in the US, we usually use kind of 30% of your income as what is affordable. But if you have to choose between necessary medication and paying your rent, then that's a violation both of the right to health and the right to housing. If you have to choose, are you going to put nutritious food on the table or am I going to pay the rent? That's a violation both of the right to food and of the right to housing. Habitability is another element. This is, what we usually think of, protecting you from the physical elements outside. and making sure that it's not moldy, lead paint, those sorts of things. Accessibility, meeting the specific needs of disadvantaged and marginalized groups. Location, housing is not adequate if it's cut off from employment opportunities, healthcare services, schools, childcare centers, in a food desert, those sorts of things, or located in polluted or dangerous areas. Environmental racism is an example of inadequate housing based on location. And cultural adequacy. The housing has to respect and take into account the expression of cultural identity. And so all of those things together, they are even further defined with tons of great legal language at the international level. And if you aren't doing all of that together, then you aren't guaranteeing the full right to adequate housing. And that's why a legalized encampment isn't meeting the right to housing. That's why moving somebody into a shelter isn't the right to housing. That's why, moving somebody into a building with lead paint and they have kids is not guaranteeing their right to housing. And as was said earlier, when you're talking about the right to housing, rights are something you demand. You're not begging for charity. You're demanding your rights, and that changes the conversation. I am entitled to all of these things fully, or you, the state, are not doing your duty to me as a human being. And we can, all of us gather under this umbrella, people who are doing tenants advocacy work, people who are working on homelessness, people who are working on environmental racism. All of these are part of the human right to housing. And that's why it's such a powerful tool for us as advocates. Additionally, the right to housing has a framework around it that says that we don't need to necessarily give every American a free house with a white picket fence tomorrow, but it does create a legal obligation to assess where we are and then take progressive steps to the maximum of our available resources to realize the right. And again, it's not optional, it's not charity, it's the duty, just like the duty on our government to provide an attorney to a person in a criminal case if they can't afford one. This is a right to which we are entitled. And what kind of difference does it make when we talk about housing as a right? Well, in Scotland, if you become homeless and present yourself to the local housing authority, there's a mandatory statutory duty for them to secure permanent accommodation for you within 90 days and temporary housing in the interim. It has to be suitable by physical proximity and other safety standards. And because this duty is put onto the local authorities, it incentivizes them to come up with a means of preventing homelessness, including creating more affordable housing, so that they don't have this duty triggered, because they have to provide that person with housing. If they don't have it there, then they can go, that person can be asked to go to another community, but that the original community is on the hook for paying for their accommodation elsewhere. And so it's always better for them to build the house locally. And this is how these accountability mechanisms that Representative Macri is going to talk about are part of changing the systemic approach so that we can address the individuals who become homeless in our system. And as a result of that, homelessness is largely vanishing. Again, it's not that nobody ever becomes homeless in Scotland, but it's this rare, brief, and temporary situation, which is kind of our goal here in the US as well. In Finland, they have a constitutional committee that reviews laws for compliance with their human rights obligations before they're even passed. For example, in 1997, the committee considered government amendments to legislation governing subsidies to entities that provide rental dwellings with these subsidies. And these amendments consisted of restrictions on the ability of those entities to sell or dispose of those properties without conditions. And the committee held that the restrictions were designed to provide the secure tenure of those tenants, and therefore they were consistent with the state's obligations under the right to housing. and that was important for them to be doing. And as a result of that and many other policies, again, Finland has cities with very few, if any, people experiencing homelessness. As Mark said earlier, this is a choice. This is the choices they are making to make their reality different. There are tons of other great ideas, other examples of all of this stuff at maketheshift.org, created by a former UN special rapporteur, the expert on housing issues, Leilani Farha. And there's tons of resources there. I'd highly recommend going to maketheshift.org. But in the meantime, there's lots of more reports and resources at our website as well. And we will continue to have some more conversations about that. But first, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Representative or Senator Anwar to hear a little bit about how he is trying to make this a practice in Connecticut.
Thank you so much, Eric. Can you guys hear me well?
Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for having me, and it's truly an honor for me to be a part of this conversation. And Eric, thank you for the help that you provided me when I was working on my bill for the past 3 years. So this started, I was asked to be the chair of a housing committee. I'm a state senator. I'm a physician by profession and also a critical care doctor and a lung doctor with a master's in public health. So I look at the illnesses from a very close perspective, as you do in the intensive care unit, but then I try to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And then that's what allowed me to look at what's going on with the homelessness in our state. And when you start to look at and interact with individuals who are experiencing homelessness, it was very clear that literally each and every case was preventable. And that's what triggered the need to have more in-depth conversations with a number of advocates. And somebody made a comment that we should have people should have the right to housing, and that just kept me up the entire night, because it was an aspirational goal that why is it that it is such a big deal to be able to make that declaration and make that as a focus. So after about thinking for 2-3 days, I said, I'm going to work to try and get this done in our state. This was pretty important because it has never been done in my state, but it's never been done in any part of United States to declare right to housing state. So I wanted to put this bill, which was an act to declare right to housing for the state of Connecticut. And as soon as this conversation started, of course, there were a lot of people who were against it right off the bat, and then they started to laugh, and then they started to make fun about the fact that you want to do this, and they had all of their minds already made in many respects. Now, I'm going to not talk about the moral arguments, because the moral arguments conversation would be good 5-6 hour long, because that is where it should be. But unfortunately, when you're looking for votes in legislative work, not everybody is impacted by moral arguments. I'll leave it at that. I started to talk to people, that the ones who wanted to look at the financial arguments, and also healthcare arguments, the amount of cost of healthcare for an individual who is experiencing unsheltered living, and then individuals who are some of the other challenges that are associated with being unsheltered for some time. For every dollar that is spent, we save about $10 to $13. And then this has been documented in so many different ways. The other thing is the outcomes are very different. If somebody has had a certain percentage, it's a relatively small percentage of individuals who are experiencing mental health illness. Their treatment is dependent on being sheltered, and then a shelter being safe. the outcomes, you can give all the medicines in the planet, they're not going to make the difference till the person is safe, secure, and in an environment that's right. So with that in mind, we put a bill forward back in 2020. It was Senate Bill 105. And the conversation was around the state's responsibility to address this. And in the initial phases, the people who were on board with the concept were worried that, well, if we are going to say that the individuals have a right, does this mean that the state is going to be exposed to lawsuits? That is going to result in an individual who's experiencing lawsuits would homelessness would actually be able to sue the state to say that, hey, it's my right not to be in this position. And as those conversations move forward, well, the first bill, we adjusted it multiple times, and I think many evenings, Eric, you were involved in looking at all the advocates who were there together, and then having some of the conversations that resulted in my lights off in the back there. And as a result, we were able to modify the bill to make sure that there were no legal ramifications for the state. And then we subsequently were able to pass it from the committee with the 7 people in favor and 4 against, and then 2 people were not present, and that it's a smaller committee for housing. It turned out a year later, I was pushing a lot of zoning laws. I was pushing a number of different laws, which were causing a lot of challenges for people across the state. And then subsequently, I was asked to just become the vice chair, not the chair of housing. But thankfully, the chair of housing was on board as well. And we put the bill again. And this time around, we adjusted it and listened to a lot of barriers that we felt. And we felt the first step is to pass this, but this time around, we actually made it into an aspirational goal and then did not have the legal requirement to reduce the legal perspective for the exposure to the state. And then we also talked about a committee that is going to look at all the policies around housing, how they're going to impact the goal of the state to be a right to housing state. And that would mean that when people are going to look at zoning laws or any of the housing laws, and as the cost of the affordable housing becomes more unachievable, the number of people who are going to experience homelessness is going to increase. We know that. So we wanted a group to be able to assess that, and we were able to pass that out of the committee as in 2021, which was Senate Bill 194. We were able to get that out of the committee, but in order for the bill to become a law, you need to have the House pass it and the Senate pass it and the governor sign it. And in between the behind the scenes concerns that were still there, that became again a bigger issue, and we were not able to move forward. This bill was much more simpler, and then this is the current bill, and we'll probably bring this forward again. And then what this did was we are starting to have more conversations. I've written op-eds, we have conversations with people. I also, for the past 4 years, have one night, especially in the winter night, I sleep outside. And with a number of people. Now we started with 4 people sleeping outside. 2 weeks ago, on the 5th of November, we had about 30 people or so slept outside in a suburban community to recognize the fact that it's not an inner city issue. It's a community issue. And any one of us can at any point experience being unsheltered because of nothing that is directly linked with us at times, and it's because of how life happens to individuals. And now we brought in 2022 Senate Bill 168, similar bill. We were able to pass it out of the committee. Now, interestingly, with the bills that we are proposing, and with the right to housing, the fiscal note is $0. There's no cost to the state. It's just focusing and making this a priority and using the existing systems to be able to prevent homelessness. Prevention is so much easier if you understand the process and the pathways that people have experienced homelessness. And as Mark was talking about the stories of individuals, all the people, rather than statistics, looking at the stories. And when you look at the stories, every single person has opportunities that were lost. And then those opportunities were because of system failures. And if we have the existing system, which is already there, to make it more functional, we can make this a rarity. And that's what the bill is talking about, is how to make it a rarity and how to make sure that the future bills that we are making are not going to worsen the problem that is there. And that's why this is work in progress, but I look at it as a journey, because now I have far more people in the communities around the state who are talking about this conversation. They look at this more. We have watered this down enough that it would be more palatable, but I need to not look at this bill in future to be a bargaining chip for other bills that my opponents at times would use. So again, I hope in a future conference we would be able to celebrate this small victory, but also more changing the hearts and minds of people every day. That is the bigger conversation that we are having. Thank you again for making me part of this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Anwar. And I think, while as a human rights advocate, it kind of killed me every step of the way, as what I had originally seen as a great legally binding right to housing in Connecticut became less than that. We'll hear more tomorrow for folks who want to come to the 201 session from Sarah Fox, who is one of the advocates who is spearheading this work at the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, about why it's actually okay, and how we can still use that bill to start the framework by which we talk about housing as a human right. And then every subsequent bill that we pass, every tenants' rights protection, every zoning bill, we're passing that not just on its own, but because housing is a human right. Because housing is a human right, we need more tenant protection. Because housing is a human right, we need to end homelessness. Because housing is human, and that way it helps to build the momentum for all of those things, and it gets it more into the political conversation, and again shifts the baseline of the conversation forward. And again, it's because it's a right, it's a demand, it's not charity. And so, yeah, it's not everything yet, but much more to come from Connecticut. And now we'd love to hear about what's going on in Washington State. Yeah, wherever you're from.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Macri, and I am a state representative in Washington. I represent a district in Seattle, and really appreciate hearing Senator Anwar's journey, because I can really relate to that through the legislative process. You're constantly making those decisions of when we stand firm and when we say a step in the right direction is worthwhile. As we often say, live to fight another day. I'll say that I come to elected office through advocacy, and have worked for many years in homelessness services, and I still do. I work for a nonprofit organization in the Seattle area that has been a champion on housing first approaches, and worked very closely with Sam Simbaris, who was here earlier for many years, going on decades at this point. And for me, doing that housing first work, all of my work for my whole career has been oriented to the fact that housing is a human right? The whole housing first philosophy is centered around that idea that people have the right to housing, and that dignity and safety go hand in hand. You can't offer one without the other. And that when you eliminate the chaos of homelessness in people's lives, their health and well-being improves, but the health and well-being of the entire community improves at the same time. So that was my focus going into elective office. And I think I was a popular candidate when I first ran, because homelessness was a growing issue of concern in my district and more so across the state. And people said, well, here's someone who can address homelessness. I don't think people originally really understood what it would take. But in my work in the legislature, I've been very much focused on housing justice issues. So really orienting my policy making around justice orientation. And that has taken form in several different policies that I've worked on. And I want to highlight relatively quickly kind of 4 different things that I've been involved in that I think move us towards this vision of housing as a human right. First is around my work on just cause eviction. We were successful in 2021 in making Washington State the 5th state in the country to have a statewide just cause eviction statute, which is a great accomplishment. And what made it even better is in that same year, we were also able to pass right to counsel statewide for low-income tenants going through eviction court. And because I sat on the budget team on the appropriations committee, was able to be the first state to actually fully fund right to counsel. So since we have enacted right to counsel, every eligible defendant going through eviction court has received representation going through that process. So that we are very committed to holding that up truly as a right in civil court proceedings, which is we've seen it in some jurisdictions, and now we see states passing it. But that commitment to the resources is really important. So for me, this idea that of eliminating no cause evictions, the idea that people could be evicted for any reason or no reason at all is something that we would have to get rid of, was something that actually was quite controversial when I brought it to the statewide context. Now, many cities have just cause eviction ordinances, but bringing it statewide, what I found is when you have a rights-based conversation, you often, as Senator Anwar indicated, you're sort of getting up against other people's rights, right? And so that's one of the big challenges when we have this conversation. And the big sort of oppositional frame that came at me was property rights. What about people's fundamental rights to private property ownership, right? So fundamental in the United States, that concept of property rights. And so we had to really engage in that conversation about the right to due process, the right to stability, et cetera, and be able to talk about how the right to a fair and just eviction process could coexist with landlords' property rights. And so that is where, you know, as they say, the sausage making happens, and sort of doing that dance when you have that conflict of perspective and rights. For me, coming to this work really has to do with racial justice. And I have found we talked a lot about the challenges in approaching. The previous speakers talked about some of the challenges in approaching this work from a racial justice perspective. And I will say that it is difficult every single day to do this work, and not because of the apparent opponents in the work, but because of the, you know, presumed allies who are actually thwarting our efforts. Because when they talk in code and when they don't talk about racial justice, and when you talk about economic justice being racial justice, we get all sorts of white fragility kind of back at us about it. And so just being ready for that, I think, is essential in doing this work. The another area I wanted to talk about, and Eric alluded to this, is my work on zoning policy. So in 2021, we were also successful in passing into law requirements on local cities to actually do planning to ensure adequate housing supply for everyone in their community across all income ranges, and to redress past racist housing policies and their impacts. This included a requirement to allow for the construction and acquisition of permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and emergency shelters in zones where other similar kinds of housing exists. And it was based on the premise, as I say, is that people should be allowed to live where people live, right? And when I had a lot of opposition to that bill about why our communities, quote, can't support people experiencing homelessness in all zones, I sort of came back with, well, what do you need to support people to do that? Because I don't understand why you say some people can live in a neighborhood and other people can't. Let's talk more about that. And when you engage with particularly local elected officials and their lobbyists, their city lobbyists, in that conversation, you can really get them to squirm. And it really is taking on kind of a rights-based approach that we all agree that we should not allow racial discrimination in housing. And people said, well, Representative, I don't understand why you're talking about race. You're talking about housing for people who are homeless, but you keep referencing racial discrimination, legacy of racial discrimination in housing. And all you need to do, of course, is point to the fact of, well, tell me who in your community is experiencing homelessness, who in our state is more likely to experience homelessness. And we were successful in passing that bill. And of course, the cities have now asked the state for a significant amount of resource to be able to do that planning. Because when you actually put the effort in to include the voices of impacted community as the law requires now, and you actually do the planning for adequate housing, it takes a lot more effort, time, and resource. So I have been a big advocate for the state to really partner with cities and to make those investments so that the adequate planning can be done. Of course, as Eric and Senator Anwar indicated, like, it's a step in the right direction, right? We really need to be clear about what are the enforcement mechanisms. Planning is nice, but planning isn't requiring action. And we were like, it's a step in the right direction. And again, I'm always operating in the space between better is better and good enough is not good enough, right? So how do we move ourselves along on that? And I think we did really put that requirement in around housing for people who have the greatest barriers to housing, as evidenced by the fact that they are currently unhoused in our communities. Two other quickly, so Mark and I work together, we're in the same community. So it was great to hear them give their points of view. And Mark alluded to coming to the work and showing that it can be done differently, like how we approach people who are living unsheltered in encampments. And instead of what has been the model for many, many years of, I don't know where you're going to go, but you just can't be here anymore, to a model of what do you need and how can we move you to a better housing situation. This past session, we had governor request legislation around what the governor called state right-of-ways. So these are public lands typically adjacent to state highways, right? And I think it's true in most of our communities. Many people who are living unsheltered will often find themselves on state property because the interstate highways often have these green spaces adjacent to them. And the governor had this bill that essentially was a bill to remove people from public rights of way, and then, try to help them was like kind of the second part. And for me, my family is Jewish. And so when I read sentences say like the policy is to remove people, obviously resonates with me in a very profound way. I was like, there's no way this bill is moving through the legislature with this framework. And so I worked with the governor's team and advocates, both in killing the bill, but also in reframing it as a budget item to say, okay, let's put a significant resource into this, but let's talk about assisting people who are living on public rights of way into meaningfully better housing situations with a real focus on permanent housing. And in doing that, and going through that debate and dialogue, we realized like just how challenging it is to get the language right to prevent the bad things from happening. I had so many advocates come back and say, well, this is great. We really love the language, but here's the 20 different ways that bad local officials can exploit this, still sweep people, still harm them. And what I found through that is that having key partners on the ground actualize the policy is so essential. So the work that Mark Jones and their partners at the local level have been doing just demonstrate that we can take policy and do the right thing and have the best success has been essential in this work. And again, a step in the right direction. When we go back this session, we are going to be able to point to the success. So our community, the Seattle community, is one of 5 demonstration communities that is doing this work on state-owned right-of-ways. Seattle has had the greatest success because of the leadership of folks like Mark and their service partners in showing that when you start with acquiring hotels, when you start with providing adequate resources and services for people who are transitioning to those hotels, and then you say to people, here's the better thing we have to offer you, more people accept that option, and more people eventually move to permanent, stable housing. In the communities where they've said, well, we don't know, we can't get a hotel, or we don't know what to do, and they just start with the outreach and the nudging back into the congregate shelters, what we find is more people stay outside longer, or they will transition short term to congregate shelter and return back to living outdoors. And so that I just want to comment that it's not just the laws and policies, but it's how we operationalize and make actual the work that we're doing. I think there's one other thing I worked on this last year, but I think I have gone on for quite a bit. So if it comes up in the Q&A, I'll talk a little bit more about some more that we're doing. But with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much. So now I would love for Kath from the ACLU of Southern California to talk a little bit about the work that's being done there to make housing as a human right recognized in the state constitution.
Thanks so much, Eric. As Eric said, my name is Kath, and I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California. And all of my clients are unhoused. Most of my clients are living in their vehicle or on the side of the freeway or in a park. And unfortunately, this is often the safest place for folks to be when, instead of investing in affordable housing, jurisdictions are criminalizing people just for existing. And so I was really excited this year when ACE, or Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, which is an amazing powerhouse organization that's tenant-led, invited us to join a coalition of that's working to create a right to housing in the state constitution in California. And the working group right now includes us, which is the ACLU of Southern California, ACE, Housing Now, and Abundant Housing. And I'm going to give you just an overview of where we're at in California, the campaign, what our lessons are so far, and kind of where we're going from here. So far, about 50 groups have already signed on to endorse the concept of a right to housing in the California Constitution, which is exciting. And this past year, we've worked with Senator Lina Gonzalez's office to introduce this past year a Senate constitutional amendment. It was called Senate Constitutional Amendment 9 and I'll drop the bill language in the chat for you, to amend the California Constitution to include housing as a fundamental right. And the bill is very short. It's 3 sentences long. And basically it declares that housing is a fundamental right, which, as we know, is a right that it receives more protection from the courts. It borrows terms from international law that Eric talked about, including adequate housing, which is important. And it calls for, it creates a common obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill a right to housing. And importantly, this would create a shared obligation between local jurisdictions like cities and counties, as well as the state, to fulfill the housing. So in terms of what it is right now, the bill was introduced this past year. It did not go to a hearing, but the coalition is working with Senator Lina Gonzalez's office and other representatives to introduce the bill this year. So I'm going to start with just kind of the philosophy behind the campaign and sort of how we're viewing the campaign. So we really see this campaign as not only a specific policy vehicle of a constitutional amendment for right to housing, but really an organizing and movement building tool and a powerful narrative shaping tool about what a right to housing is and also what it isn't. We believe that this supports the idea that housing should not be a commodity whose access is limited by the private market. We believe the private market is not going to solve houselessness and is housing justice, that our access to public assistance for housing, like our Section 8, should not be a lottery system like it is right now. Also, as some of the other speakers have already discussed, the right to housing needs to be discussed in a racial justice and racial equity framework. And so one of the things the campaign is doing is really focusing on California's reparations task force and how the right to housing dovetails with the recommendations, policy recommendations that came out of the California Reparations Task Force report. Because we all know that the stark statistics, 4 in 10 folks buying housing in California are Black. Eviction rates are much higher for Black families. Homeownership rates are at historic lows for Black families. And so it's really important that we focus on structural, systemic, historic, racist policies, whether it's in banking, housing policy to shape that. And so we're really looking to the California Reparations Committee and the recommendations there to tie into the California Right to Housing campaign. In terms of the strategy for the campaign, we're looking at this as a long-term fight. We may not win next year, we may not win the year after that, or even the year after that, but it's a long-term fight. And like I said, narrative changing tool to really educate both legislators and the public about what a right to housing is. Because surprisingly, a lot of people are talking about a right to housing. As Eric mentioned, a lot of our federal and local politicians are now saying that housing is a human right and echoing that refrain, but we've seen very little progress to that end. And also the definition of housing as a right to a lot of the politicians means something. And so it's really important to get out ahead of that and define what a right to housing is. And we'll look to international models, like Eric said, and NHLC has been really helpful to the coalition in terms of looking at these international models. And what our campaign seeks to do is answer some of those questions, like, for example, is shelter part of a right to housing? And the answer is no, because adequate housing as defined under international law includes security of tenure, And shelter, congregate shelter, does not provide significant tenure. It also doesn't provide a lot of other things. I've never had a client who's ever wanted to go into congregate shelter because it's terrible. But international law and adequacy address that. Additionally, could a uninhabitable SRO qualify under right to housing? And the answer again is no, because international definition of adequacy requires habitability. And so those definitions are really important. In terms of where we're going, we are working with elected officials to reintroduce the bill, like I said, next year, and crafting a report on a right to housing that we're going to release and share with pretty much anyone who will listen next year. We have a lot of events planned for the year ahead, educational events, including an event in January with UN rapporteurs who are going to talk about what a right to housing would look like in California and what we can learn from international law. We're planning a tribunal where folks who are experiencing housing insecurity, experiencing houselessness, are going to basically see what the right to housing in California should look like, because it needs to be defined and shaped by folks living it. And that's one of the reasons we're really excited to work hand in hand with ACE and Housing Now, which are tenant organizations that are tenant-led and member-led by folks experiencing housing insecurity. And we'll also be thinking about a city-by-city approach, because the city of San Diego actually just voted on a resolution declaring housing a human right. And so a city-by-city approach, even though those are symbolic resolutions, they can help to build support for a statewide right. So we're looking at a lot of things. In terms of what we've learned so far, something that's surprising to me is just how many people are talking about a right to housing. People are excited about it. And the public is on our side. We've seen a lot of voter-approved initiatives this election cycle in California, including one that we at ACLU SoCal worked really hard on called Measure ULA, which was a tax on mega mansions to fund affordable housing protections to the tune of approximately $1 billion a year in the city of LA. And the good news, that initiative won. It won by over 54% of the popular vote. And so starting next year, we're going to have a new $1 billion a year in terms of affordable housing in the city of LA. So the public is with us, but we need to really get out ahead of some of the politicians who may be co-opting the term right to housing. We saw that in Sacramento this year with Measure O, where a politician named Darrell Steinberg was in favor of this measure that sometimes was trumpeted as a right to housing, but really it included tent encampment and shelter, and included carceral solutions where you're forced to accept basically anything that's offered to you under threat of criminal penalty, which is not included in a right to housing and should never be called a right to housing. And so we need to get out ahead of that curve. And then in terms of other challenges, another challenge is just that cities are always looking for ways to criminalize. And it seems like we're always on the defense, fighting back against criminalization measures. And we need to really, think about proactive measures to create affirmative. So that's one of the challenges that we've seen. Another thing is there's a dearth of literature about how a right to housing can play out in the US context. So some of this work that we're doing state by state, city by city, analyzing a right to housing is so needed. And really we think, NHLC for being a thought leader for decades now on this issue. So the last thing I'll say is just that we're really excited to work with everybody here. This is truly a national movement, an international movement. It feels really exciting right now to be here with all of you and learn from each other and hopefully work together to make it happen in all of our regions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kath. Great work going on, and love to turn it over to Judith now to talk about what's going on in New York City. They're not quite as advanced in what's going on there, but I think it's a really instructive kind of how they're approaching it, because that's probably where many other people are as well. So Judith, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
All good. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, really, Eric, so much for this invitation, but also for all of your help on the work that our group has done looking at the right to housing in New York. Before I begin, I just want to say that I've also been very privileged to work with a lot of people in my research over the years in homelessness, in particular, noted several times this evening. Well, where I am, it's this evening. Where you are, it's this afternoon. Early work that I was privileged to do with Samson Barris in New York City when the research was being done to prove that housing first is a solution to homelessness. Unfortunately, it is not the prevailing intervention or program used in New York. It's used many other places to great effect, but not in New York. New York is, for the most part, a shelter first, not housing first city. And I'll start by telling you that a few years ago, my team at HomeWorks and I conducted a study taking a close look at what a right to housing might look like for New York, particularly for families and children. We fully support a right to housing for everyone, but our particular area of work is on homelessness and precariously housed families with children. But you can't really do a study like that in New York without examining the right to shelter, because as we learned, there are many ways that the two are interconnected. And I want to be clear that I'm a proponent of a right to shelter that is safe, infrequent, and brief. And that I do believe that people will need shelter in an emergency, and that in that way, we may always have some amount of homelessness. However, having shelter that's safe, infrequent, and brief does not really reflect the current system in New York. We see that, for example, children who are homeless with their families spend on average 2 school years in shelter. That is not brief. So while doing our research, we learned some very interesting things. The first is the right to shelter in New York City and New York State was established in 1979 in the form of a consent decree. A lot of people refer to it as a law, but it's not a law. And the consent decree was originally a settlement of sorts resulting from a lawsuit filed by one of the co-founders of the Coalition for the Homeless in New York, Robert Hayes, who sued the city and state in New York Supreme Court on behalf of homeless men living on the street. During our research, we interviewed quite a few of the lawyers and advocates who were originally involved in the right to shelter, what became the right to shelter consent decree, including Robert Hayes, who was the lawyer who filed the suit. We asked everyone we interviewed if they had considered pushing for a right to housing. Mostly they explained that their immediate priority at the time was to establish a remedy that required New York to provide shelter so people could get off the streets, out of the elements where it was proven that they were suffering from extreme physical, mental, and psychosocial hardships. The lawyers and advocates for the homeless who we interviewed also told us, almost every one of them told us, that they had discussed asking for a right to housing, but felt that if they could get the right to shelter at that time, they would come back to the courts and pursue the right to housing. 43 years later, they have not followed up. Nothing has been done to ask the courts for or file a law for a right to housing in New York. As a remedy for homelessness, the right to shelter, we believe, is necessary but not sufficient. A fuller remedy to homelessness is a right to housing, a right that includes shelter for the immediate emergency, but stipulates that the real goal is rehousing within a reasonable time. A right to housing should also include the right to stay in your current housing whenever possible. So, for example, if ultimately you're entitled to a housing subsidy or other supports to ensure permanent housing, like in New York, we have a lot of different types of subsidies and vouchers available. But many of them are not available until you're actually in shelter for a certain amount of time. But we believe that a right to housing should include that if you're entitled to those supports, you should be able to get them without having to enter shelter. You should be able to access them while you're still housed in every possible instance. This would be a form of prevention. And this also makes sense from both a human rights perspective and an economic perspective. And as you all know, the field has proven over and over again that housing is less expensive and better for people than shelter. I know I have only a few minutes, but it's also important to understand the unintended consequences of the existing right to shelter consent decree in New York with no right to housing as the remedy. The city has arguably the worst homeless problem in the US and spends the most money managing homelessness. In pure economic terms, the New York City Department of Homeless Services spent $3 billion in fiscal year 2022. This is the direct cost, but many of us estimate another $1 billion or more is spent by other government entities, including health-related costs, education, child welfare, and of course, the list goes on and on. In addition, we're fortunate in New York that there are many philanthropies and foundations that fund programs and services for people who are homeless. So the total cost may well be closer to $5 billion a year. Money that would way more than pay for the rent and housing related costs for every person who is homeless. This is what we refer to as the homeless industrial complex, the $5 billion that we spend every year. So you might be wondering why New York City does not move toward a right to housing, since it's spending so much money on homelessness. First, I need to reiterate that the right to shelter needs to be in place for emergencies. And I'm going to go a little further than that and say that my speaking about this topic and the work that my team did on examining a right to housing, and because we did that, having to look at the right to shelter, is something that many who work in the homeless industrial complex, advocates, people who work in shelters, people who run shelters, were not happy we were doing. There's a very protectionist atmosphere around the right to shelter in New York. And our work really concluded that in some ways, this prevents us from moving on to a right to housing. So if you or others you talk to, and people come up to me all the time and say, oh, I wish our city or our town had a right to shelter, I think the answer should be, we should take a close look at New York. If that's it's not necessarily the best remedy to homelessness. In fact, we don't believe it is. We do believe, however, that if New York had a right to housing, it would force the government to do what it has done with the right to shelter. That is to provide housing and all of the funding that's needed in order to ensure that it be available to people. New York has proved that it can do it with shelter, and now they really need to do it with housing and require adequate, affordable housing. Importantly, for individuals who lack an affordable home, and it's due to our national and local history of institutional racism, we also believe that the right to housing should give an advantage in the housing market to those people. There are those in New York who argue that we must first ensure that the shelter system is fully funded and accessible to all who need it before we turn our attention to a right to housing. They fear we could lose the important and hard-won right to shelter in the process. But a well-constructed right to housing, a law, would ensure that shelter is available in emergencies, but only for emergencies and only for brief periods of time. If we do not pursue the right to housing in New York City, the numbers of homeless people will likely continue to increase, and the system will remain at a breaking point with or without a continuing influx of asylum seekers. And even if the number of homeless people start to decrease, it will be at a very slow pace, a process that will take tens of years or more to result in an emergency system, not the full system we have now. I'll close by stating an obvious but important ethical reason why we need a right to housing. Shelters are inherently racist institutions. The vast majority of people who are or have been homeless in New York City are people of color. Shelters are places where we hide people as if they were bad actors, and we fill their lives with rules and punishment. If you compare the life of a family in a shelter to a family with a lease, you'll find that the institution has stripped away much of the normal family and important parental roles and autonomy. Teens, for example, cannot be in a shelter unit without an adult present. So after school, they have to linger outside the building or in marginal spaces after school, where obviously they can get into a lot of trouble. Kids can't stay away overnight, you know, like to go to a sleepover with a friend without shelter administration approval. Residents don't get a key to the front door. They have to sign in and out. And the normal protections of a lease are not in place for families or anyone living in shelter. We've had many governors and mayors who've been managing the shelter system in New York since 1979. Our belief is that we need to move to a right to housing environment where the remedy to homelessness is housing. We began our work to attempt to influence the mayoral race that happened in 2021 and the governor's race that just concluded. And while we were able to get many candidates to make statements about why we need to have a right to housing in New York and why we need to examine the right to shelter, we really haven't made very much progress. There is no current legislation pending. And we have an ad hoc working group in the background that meets to discuss it, but other progress has not been made, unfortunately.
Thank you, Judith. It's a start. It's where you are, and it's and the consciousness is building. And I think what we can see from everybody that it's building all across the country. So I would love to invite folks from the room to ask questions for any of our panelists, and yeah, we'll have a full conversation about what's going on. Go ahead.
I believe it's Ms. Rogers. The right to housing resolution, that's an aspirational resolution. Is that correct? You've got no substantive rights that are attached to it.
Thank you for that question. I unfortunately can't see the speakers, but I could hear your question. So I believe the question was, is there legal effect to the California constitutional amendment that we're pushing for? Yeah. And that's why, unfortunately, you know, it's a long-term fight. So I did put the text of the bill. I can put it into the chat again for folks, but it does call for a criminal right, which would come with a private right of action as well as a public right of action. So it, you know, people could sue to enforce the right, and you know, as with every state, the legislative intent is really important, and so how the right is shaped through legislative hearings, the definitions that are included in the actual text are going to be really important. And if we're relying on extrinsic aids like international law, courts will look to that too. But no, the right that we are pushing for in the state constitution would have legal effect. It would create an obligation on the part of local and state government to take actions to fulfill the right. And there's also a negative right associated with it too, right? Because governments also have to respect and protect the right. So if governments take actions that get in the way of your right to access adequate housing, that is also a violation of the right. So there's an obligation to create policies and fund housing, but there's also that negative right as well. And what I referenced regarding cities with resolutions, those are strictly symbolic resolutions. And so the city of San Diego passed a resolution to support a right to housing, and that's completely symbolic. And so if cities do that, it's really just to show public support for this idea, but that has no legal effect. That's really just part of a movement kind of strategy.
Yeah, I'll say that 10 or 15 years ago, there were a number of cities that started passing these resolutions, or counties saying they supported the human right to housing. But my feeling there is, like, if you pass that resolution and you don't actually have any plan for how you're going to implement it, then it actually does as much harm as good, because then you can, the city says, we're a human right to housing city, but look at all the people still experiencing homelessness. Look at all the people still being, evicted unnecessarily. So I think there is organizing value in starting with those kind of non-binding resolutions at the local level, but you have to have a plan in place for what comes after that's going to make it real. And it doesn't have to be immediate, but like, if it just stays words on paper, then it's a problem. But one of the things we'll talk about in the 201 session tomorrow is, a human right to housing report card as a strategy. So taking those 7 elements, measuring your city, your state, whatever it is, against them, and saying, if we're a human right to housing city or state, then here's what it looks like in practice. Here's what we are doing. Here's what we're not doing. Here's where we're falling short. And then you can use it to trigger, we need a just cause eviction law. We need, the right to counsel, and use it as a strategy to help push those pieces that are going to help make the right real and process. And also, you've obviously got this trade-off, whereas Kath and the ACLU and the effort out there is, they're sticking to this legally binding private right of action approach. That's going to be really hard to pass. Senator Anwar has said, we're willing to give that up in order to get something passed. And, you talked about it as well, Nicole, like, they're both strategies towards the same end, and you can choose when you want to employ one or the other. So, yeah.
I have a question for Representative Marcy about the right to counsel. When you guys implemented that, is the council then employed through existing legal aid organizations? Did you have to create like a new statewide system? Like, practically, how did that work in your state?
Thank you. And for those who are joining us remotely, the question is, how does the right to counsel work in Washington State? Did we set up something new, or access to existing legal aid organizations? So yes, the answer is yes to all of that. We, our statewide Office of Civil Legal Aid created a new program, right to counsel program. And the implementation was a bit challenging. The biggest pain points were due to the fact that in Washington State, we have a decentralized court system. And so we have 39 different, or 35, anyone who is here from Washington may know better than me. We have 39 counties, but we have, I think, 35 kind of court jurisdictions. And going to those court officers and, figuring out the pathways for referral created some challenges, because not all those of you who work in the legal profession won't be surprised to learn that not all judges fully embraced this idea that defendants that the law even said that defendants had a right to counsel, and that the court was obligated to make a referral to counsel. So our Office of Civil Legal Aid at the state level did a lot of advocacy with the courts. Our Attorney General was helpful in that as well. And it's been an evolving process. It passed in 2021. We, took a best guess. Now, remember, we were going through the pandemic. We had an eviction, I'd say one of the strongest eviction moratoriums in the country in Washington State. And so we were sort of estimating what kind of need we would have for it. And so last year we added additional funding to ensure that we were able to have enough attorneys in all the areas across the state. And again, they're coming back this year for more resource. And we are actually putting a push because we're learning a lot more, right? Because what we found previous to this is over 80% of cases were found by default, meaning people did not show up. They got pay or vacate notice and court date, and they were like, well, I guess I'm just going to lose. I don't have representation. They don't even go to court. So now we're finding a lot more folks are coming to court because they have representation. But we're also finding that if they had legal representation sooner, legal advice much sooner than arriving at the courthouse door, evictions would be much more likely to be prevented. So we're working on a pretrial representation program. We provided some small amount of funding for that last year, and we're going to push for more resource. While we've made a lot of progress, this remains somewhat controversial. This idea that not only do you expand rights, but you give people the opportunity to actually uphold and defend their rights. Again, I think this idea of follow the money, I appreciate that. I subscribe to that analysis as well. It is the challenge. And I will say, I do want to make a comment too, because what we've heard previously about the kind of intersection of racial justice and housing justice, what we're finding now too, and I really feel like this is like a tried and true method of white supremacy, is that now what I'm hearing about the conflict in rights is around the rights of small Black landlords and their ability to uphold their ability to maintain their properties as being in conflict with the right of tenants, right? So this is definitely a tool of white supremacy, and the opposition is exploiting this idea that the arguments we're hearing right now is you've made it a lot more expensive to remove tenants from their homes. And this is a hardship on families who have been able, against all odds, to be able to acquire property to build wealth as small landlords. And so it is causing us to think about how do we balance that. Those needs are real, that there are small landlords who are struggling to both understand the law and to have the resource to really engage in the kind of due process, because it used to be you just put that pay or vacate notice on the door. 80% of the time tenants wouldn't show up and they would be out of your unit. And now when they're represented, it really changes the rules of the game. And so I want to make a comment on that, because it isn't always as simple as just like securing the right? There's when the system is built on the sort of discriminatory approaches that our system is built on, we have to continually evolve and respond. And so I'm engaging now with many of my Black colleagues in the House of Representatives around, so as we uphold the rights of tenants, what are we doing for our small Black landlords?
Thank you so much. I hope this is whetted your appetite for more conversation. I'm sad that we have to cut this short, but that's why we have 2 more sessions tomorrow to talk more about this. I want to really thank our panelists for helping help us see what it looks like in the messy process of making the human right to housing real. We're going to take a 15-minute break and then come back for the next session. Thank you for sticking with us through these first couple hours.